the ranger station that never closes. I had a routine before Coldwater Point. Seasonal work rewards routine. I woke before sunrise, logged overnight weather, checked radio traffic, and spent long hours doing the kind of work nobody notices unless it's done wrong. Trail condition reports, erosion surveys, timber plot data. I liked the quiet. I liked that the forest didn't ask questions. My supervisors saw me as reliable, which in that system meant invisible. That was fine. I planned to finish the season, apply for a permanent slot, and keep my head down. The reassignment came by phone in late September 2021. District admin said the Southern Ranger stations were short-staffed because of a mandatory training seminar in Olympia. Coldwater Point needed administrative coverage, 5 nights, no field patrols, just radio logs and incident intake. The tone was casual, like they were asking me to water plants. I didn't argue. Temporary assignments were how you proved flexibility. Coldwater Point is not on tourist maps. It sits near the forest's southern boundary, 43 miles from Packwood, the last town with reliable fuel and cell service. Forest Road 26 is the only access. Gravel, narrow, no guardrails. When it rains, it turns into something closer to slurry than road. The station itself was built in the late 80s after a string of wildfires. Thick walls, reinforced door, small windows. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to hold out. Carl, the outgoing ranger, met me in the parking pullout. He didn't shake my hand. He pointed at the antenna, the radio console, and the logbook cabinet. He told me not to touch the second shelf unless I was instructed. When I asked what he meant, he said, "You won't be." Then he left. He didn't look back. The first irregularity showed up in the paperwork. The logbook was older than the station renovations suggested. Entries were methodical, almost clinical. Names, times, weather, visitor counts. But there were gaps. Entire weeks missing, then resumed as if nothing happened. The handwriting changed often, but certain phrases repeated verbatim over decades. No external contact after dusk. Station remains operational. Visitor interaction deferred. By Tuesday night, I'd stopped chalking it up to bureaucratic weirdness. That was the night I heard the footsteps. They were too even for an animal. No scraping, no pause. Someone was circling the building, testing the perimeter. When I called out, the sound stopped immediately, like it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. The note the next morning was not written by kids. The paper was old, fibrous. The ink had bled with age, not moisture. I documented it, photographed it, and radioed district. My supervisor told me to log it as a nuisance incident and move on. He didn't ask for the photo. He didn't ask me to email anything. That was the first time I felt like I'd stepped outside the boundaries of what I was allowed to know. Wednesday, I started recognizing patterns. The radio traffic was wrong. Call signs repeated that shouldn't have. Trail crews reported in from locations that hadn't been active in years. When I checked the GIS data, those trailheads were listed as decommissioned. When I brought that up, dispatch corrected me using outdated map numbers, ones that matched the older logbooks. That night, after the knocking, I recorded audio on my phone. Low voices outside, overlapping, coordinated, not arguing, not whispering, waiting. When they said my name and personal details, I understood this wasn't random. Someone had pulled my personnel file, someone with access. When I ran, I didn't take the front road because that's where they were. I moved down slope, away from the clearing. I could hear movement paralleling me for the first 10 minutes. Then nothing. That silence was worse than pursuit. Forest silence means attention. At the sheriff's office, my statement was taken, but not logged the way it should have been. No incident number, no request for my audio recording. When we returned to the station, the physical evidence was gone. The logbook replacement was the most alarming part. Records don't just revert themselves. That requires intention. After I resigned, I filed a formal complaint with the Forest Service's regional office. I attached my photos, my audio, and a timeline. I received a letter acknowledging receipt and nothing else. Months later, I learned through a public records request that my file had been marked administratively resolved. No resolution details attached. Here's what I can confirm through documents I later obtained. Between 1990 and 2019, 11 personnel assigned to Coldwater Point either resigned abruptly or transferred without exit interviews. 3 names appear in county missing persons databases, but were later annotated as located without location data. 1 supervisor, my supervisor, signed off on all of it. He retired quietly in 2022. The evidence cache I still have sits on an external drive. Audio files with timestamps that don't match satellite logs. Scanned logbook pages that don't align with official archives. A maintenance invoice for Coldwater Point listed under a different facility code entirely. When I tried to submit this to a federal oversight office, I was advised, off the record, that I was misinterpreting internal continuity protocols. The unresolved part is simple. Coldwater Point Station is still operational. It still appears staffed on internal rosters, though no one I know has been assigned there since. Forest Road 26 remains open, and every few months, usually on a Thursday, I receive automated system emails meant for Coldwater Point's radio console. Status pings, as if the station is reporting itself. The letter I received last month confirmed what I already suspected. Whatever monitors that place doesn't stop at the tree line. It understands records, it understands time, and it operates with institutional permission. I don't go into forests anymore because I don't believe they're empty, and because some stations, no matter what the logs say, never close. The shipwreck that moves. I was living a predictable academic life in early 2020. I taught maritime archaeology at the University of Oregon, split my time between lectures, grant proposals, and slow summer fieldwork along inland river systems. My work rarely involved danger. Most days were spent cataloging timbers, comparing hull joinery, and arguing over dates that shifted by decades, not lives. I had no history of chasing mysteries. I documented what could be proven and left speculation to others. The assignment came in late May. Oregon Parks and Recreation contacted me through the university, requesting a short-term site documentation of a newly exposed shipwreck near Cape Perpetua. The language in the email was routine: assess, photograph, GPS map, recommend preservation status, no urgency, no alarm. The wreck had been spotted by a recreational kayaker during an unusually low tide. Parks wanted preliminary documentation before winter storms erased it again. Cape Perpetua is technically accessible, but practically isolated. Highway 101 passes through, yet the coastline there is cliffs, forest, and violent surf. No marinas, no harbors, just rock shelves exposed for a few hours at a time. I accepted because that kind of exposure window is rare, and because the initial drone footage suggested a mid-19th century merchant hull, valuable but not controversial. I arrived in early June with 2 graduate assistants, Liam O'Connell and Sophia Reyes. We stayed in a Forest Service cabin 6 miles north of the site. No cell service, 1 radio. The nearest town, Yashats, was close enough for supplies, but far enough that the coastline itself felt abandoned. Even during daylight, the place absorbed sound. Wind, surf, and nothing else. The first day at the site was unremarkable. The wreck sat on a basalt shelf, roughly 60 feet long, hull ribs exposed, planking intact in sections. Barnacles and kelp growth were extensive. The orientation suggested it had been driven in hard and settled where it lay. I placed GPS-tagged reference stakes at the bow, stern, and midship, logged coordinates, photographed everything, and returned to the cabin to back up data. On the second morning, the numbers didn't match. The GPS points had shifted, not dramatically, 12 to 15 feet depending on the stake. At first, I assumed user error or tidal interference. We recalibrated, reset the markers, and continued documentation. I noted the discrepancy in my field log and moved on. The first warning came from a local we encountered on the trail, an older man walking his dog who stopped when he saw our gear. He asked what we were working on. When I told him, he went quiet, then said only, "That thing doesn't like being measured." I dismissed it as coastal folklore. People say things like that around old wrecks. On the fourth day, Liam uncovered a brass plate near the stern, partially buried beneath sand and shell fragments. It was intact, heavily corroded but legible. I photographed it in situ before cleaning it. The engraving read, SS Mariana, Portsmouth, 1847. That night, I cross-referenced the name through Lloyd's Register, British Admiralty lists, and American port records. There was no SS Mariana registered out of Portsmouth in 1847, or any year. No insurance filings, no launch records, nothing. The absence was complete, which is unusual. Even lost or scuttled vessels leave paperwork trails. Sophia suggested it could be a renamed ship or a forgery. But the metallurgy of the plate, the corrosion patterns, and the hull construction were consistent with mid-19th century exposure. I added the anomaly to the report draft and requested archival assistance from the university library. By the sixth day, the pattern had escalated. We reached the rock shelf at low tide and found nothing. No wreck, no fragments, no disturbed kelp or debris field, just bare stone and tide pools. I assumed burial by surf until I checked the surrounding area. There was no evidence of collapse or displacement. The shelf looked untouched. We expanded the search radius. After nearly 2 hours, Liam suggested checking the original GPS coordinates rather than the physical site. When we did, we found the wreck a quarter-mile down the coast, resting on a different shelf. It was positioned parallel to the shoreline, stable, intact. The brass plate was still fixed near the stern. The barnacle growth was unchanged, but carved into the foredeck, fresh cuts through algae and growth, were 4 words. Turn back now. No tool marks we could identify, no debris. The tide window was too short for human relocation, and the physics made it implausible regardless. I photographed everything, logged coordinates, and radioed Parks immediately. They sent a regional supervisor the next day. His name was Bill Kowalski. He arrived alone, took his own photos, asked a few questions, and spent less than 30 minutes at the site. Away from Liam and Sophia, he told me he'd seen similar reports over the years, always near Cape Perpetua. Wrecks that didn't stay put. When I asked why there was no documentation, he said the department stopped investigating after a prior recovery attempt ended in fatalities. 3 researchers. Official cause: accidental drowning. Unofficial details were never written down. That night, I requested internal parks records through a professional courtesy channel. What I received was minimal. Incident summaries, redacted names, no site coordinates, a pattern of closures justified by unsafe environmental conditions. Institutional silence framed as policy. The tension shifted after that. At the cabin, we heard footsteps outside at night, not approaching, just pacing. When we checked, there was nothing. On the coast, the usual sounds would drop away without warning. No surf, no wind, just pressure, like being observed. I decided to terminate the project early. I cited unsafe conditions and inconclusive findings and returned to Eugene. 2 weeks later, Sophia called me. She was shaken. She'd been having recurring dreams of a storm at sea, of voices calling her name from below deck. She sought hypnotherapy to address sleep paralysis. Under regression, she described being a crew member aboard the SS Mariana. She named officers, listed cargo, and described a mutiny in 1847 off the Oregon coast. I recorded the session transcripts and cross-referenced the names she provided. 3 matched sailors reported missing from other vessels in the same decade, men who vanished at sea without explanation. I submitted everything: GPS logs, photos, transcripts, correspondence, to a federal cultural resources archive as required. The response was procedural, acknowledgement, no follow-up. Last year, a graduate student from Portland State contacted me. She'd found drone footage of a wreck near Cape Perpetua. Same dimensions, same orientation. She wanted advice. I told her to delete the footage and stay away. 3 weeks later, her body was found near the tide pools. Cause of death: salt water in the lungs. No signs of drowning. The site remains officially undocumented. Cape Perpetua is still open to the public, and every few years someone reports a shipwreck that doesn't stay where it's supposed to. The logging camp with no exit. My name is Samuel Ortega. Before the fall of 2019, my life was uncomplicated. I worked seasonal contracts for Pacific Timber Solutions, a mid-sized logging contractor that specialized in selective harvest operations across Washington state. I wasn't management. I wasn't union leadership. I was a saw operator and field tech who handled mapping, compliance photos, and daily reports. I liked the work because it was predictable. You went where the map told you. You cut what the permit allowed. You left when the quota was filled. In late September, I was assigned to a temporary camp deep inside the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. The tract had just been auctioned. Remote, difficult terrain, but nothing unusual on paper. 6-person crew, 30-day window, standard environmental restrictions. The kind of job no one remembered once it was done. The assignment came through Bill Haywood, our foreman. Bill had been with Pacific Timber since the 90s. He was practical, not imaginative, and he trusted paperwork more than instinct. When he said the job was clean, that usually meant it was. The access route was 38 miles from the nearest paved road. The last 10 miles weren't really a road at all, just an old service cut that had partially reclaimed itself. We had to clear it as we went. That took 2 full days of chainsaws, gravel fill, and manual grading. No cell service, satellite phone only, for emergencies. We set camp in a clearing near tributary of the Entiat River. 2 sleeping trailers, 1 kitchen tent, generator, fuel cache, and a small equipment pad for Rosa's Caterpillar. We logged GPS coordinates, took setup photos, and sent the initial compliance packet back to the office. Everything was normal. That's what made the first night stand out. The forest was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced before. No insects, no owls, no background noise beyond wind moving through the upper canopy and water far off. I remember lying awake and realizing I could hear my own breathing clearly, like the space around us was hollow. On the second day, Danny and Keith went out to mark the first cut line. They were experienced fellers and didn't spook easily. They came back before noon. Danny wouldn't make eye contact. Keith kept looking behind him, even inside the clearing. They told us they'd found structures about a mile northwest of camp. Cabins, rough-built, maybe a dozen of them, arranged in a loose circle. Most were rotting. Some had collapsed. But several showed recent use. Blue tarps, plastic tubs with canned food, sleeping bags that hadn't been exposed to weather long enough to mildew. Bill radioed the Forest Service District office. He gave them our coordinates and described what we'd found. The response came back after a delay. There were no registered permits or known occupants in that area. They said someone would be sent to check it out, but it would take a few days due to staffing. That night, we heard voices. They weren't close enough to make out words. They came in waves, rising and falling, echoing through the trees. It sounded like multiple people speaking at once, but not arguing, not laughing. The language wasn't anything I recognized. It carried for a long time, then stopped all at once. Rosa wanted to shut down the generator and leave. Bill said we'd wait for the Forest Service. He said panic made mistakes. On the third morning, Keith didn't come to breakfast. His trailer door was closed. Inside, his bed had been slept in. His boots were by the door. His jacket was gone. There were no signs of a struggle. No tracks outside, that made sense. We searched for 6 hours. We followed the cut lines, the riverbank, and the area Danny had marked the day before. We called his name until our voices were raw. There was no response. No evidence he'd left camp under his own power, and no indication he'd been taken. Bill tried the satellite phone. No signal. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. Danny went to check the access road. When he came back, his face had drained of color. He said the road was gone. We walked out to see for ourselves. The cleared route, the one we'd cut and filled over 2 days, was overgrown. Not just obstructed. Gone. Trees stood where we'd cut them down, trunks thick, bark intact, undergrowth dense and undisturbed. It looked like a forest that hadn't been touched in decades. Rosa tried driving the Caterpillar anyway. We followed on foot, cutting as we went. The terrain twisted back on itself. Every direction we took, we ended up back at the clearing. The GPS units showed movement, but the coordinates never changed. By the 4th day, Jim disappeared. He'd been in the kitchen tent preparing dinner. I stepped away to check the generator. When I came back, the tent was empty. The pot was still warm. The knife he'd been using was on the table. That night, the voices came closer. We could hear footfalls outside the perimeter. Shapes moved between the trees. They were human-shaped, but proportionally wrong. Too tall. Limbs hanging lower than they should. They never stepped into the light. Bill said we'd leave at first light and follow the river downstream. Rivers always lead somewhere. That was the last plan he made that sounded rational. We packed only what we could carry. We moved fast. After 2 hours of hiking, the river bent sharply, and there was our camp, exactly as we'd left it. Danny broke down. He started screaming that we were dead, that this was hell, that we'd died without knowing it. Bill restrained him until he calmed down. On the 6th day, Bill finally reached someone on the satellite phone. The connection was weak but clear enough to understand. The voice identified itself as Forest Service Dispatch. They said they had our location. A helicopter was en route. ETA 90 minutes. We waited in the clearing. Exactly 90 minutes later, we heard rotors. The helicopter landed. 2 rangers stepped out. One of them stared at us for a long time before speaking. Then he said, "Jesus Christ, you've been missing for 3 weeks." We tried to explain everything on the flight out, the cabins, the voices, the road, the men who vanished, The rangers didn't argue, they just wrote things down. We were hospitalized and evaluated. The official explanation was environmental exposure. Carbon monoxide from the generator. Possible neurotoxic spores from decomposing wood. Stress-induced disorientation. Keith and Jim were never found. Search teams worked the area for a month. No remains, no equipment, no trace. After I was cleared, I filed a formal request for the Forest Service incident file. Most of it was routine, reports, maps, redacted communications, but one appendix stopped me cold. In 1974, a logging crew of 7 men went missing in that exact area. They were recovered 3 weeks later, dehydrated and disoriented. They claimed the forest had trapped them. Only 5 made it out. The file noted that access restrictions were recommended at the time. Those restrictions were never implemented. The tract we were sent to log had been flagged once before, and someone, somewhere, had decided it was acceptable to send another crew in anyway. The site is still classified as active forest land. No permanent closure, no warning markers. Sometimes I wonder how many times the paperwork has been updated and how many times the same mistake has been made. The trail cam footage before this assignment, my work was predictable in the way field biology often is. I split my weeks between office analysis and backcountry maintenance hikes. Mornings were data entry, GPS coordinates, species counts, migration timelines. Afternoons were planning routes, checking weather windows, preparing equipment. I worked alone most of the time, which I preferred. The Cascades are large enough that solitude feels procedural rather than ominous. You expect quiet. You trust it. In early 2021, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife renewed my contract and expanded my scope. Predator monitoring in the North Cascades had become a priority after a series of livestock losses along the park boundary. My role was narrow. Deploy and service motion-activated trail cameras, retrieve SD cards, catalog footage, flag anomalies. It wasn't enforcement, it wasn't search and rescue, it was documentation. The specific camera near Cascade Pass was installed in late August. High elevation, low foot traffic after Labor Day. The terrain there funnels wildlife through a narrow saddle, which makes it useful for population estimates. It's also remote, 9 miles from the nearest trailhead, another 4 to any ranger station. Once you're there, radio reception is unreliable. That's standard. You log your route, your expected return, and you work. The first irregularity appeared before I even left the site. When I checked the camera's activation counter, it showed over 300 triggers in 28 days. That's an outlier. Even during peak migration, we don't see that volume. I assumed malfunction. Wind, shifting branches, snow glare. I swapped the card, reseated the unit, and hiked out before dusk. I reviewed the footage that night in my office in Marble Mount. The early clips were consistent with expectations. Deer at dawn, a bear passing through at night, 2 hikers with headlamps who never noticed the camera. Then, midway through September, the pattern broke. At 2:13 a.m. on September 14th, the frame filled with a figure that didn't trigger movement the way an animal does. It was already there when the clip started, standing just inside the sensor range. The proportions were wrong. The infrared flattened detail, but the height relative to the trees was unmistakable. It didn't move for the full 11-minute clip. No sway, no shift in weight, just orientation, facing the lens. As I moved through the subsequent clips, the behavior repeated. The figure appeared closer each time, as if it understood the camera's threshold. Sometimes it crouched, sometimes it was on all fours. The limbs articulated in ways that didn't match known gait patterns. By September 28th, there were 4 of them, arranged side by side, occupying the full width of the frame, all facing forward. I pulled metadata. The timestamps were clean. No signs of digital manipulation. I cross-referenced moon phases, weather reports, and trail usage permits. There were no authorized night hikes in that corridor during those dates. I escalated to my supervisor. She reviewed the clips with me and categorized them as a probable hoax. Costume, coordinated hikers. She advised me to note it as human interference and move on. When I asked why similar footage was appearing on cameras miles apart, she said coincidence doesn't require explanation if it's inconvenient. That answer didn't align with the data. I accessed footage from 3 other cameras in adjacent drainages. Same figures, same postures, same fixation on the lens, different dates, different weather. Always night. Always stillness before movement. I sent anonymized clips to a colleague at the University of Washington who specializes in primate biomechanics. I didn't tell him where they were taken. I asked for a movement analysis. 2 days later, he called me directly. He said the joint articulation didn't match human anatomy. The stride length exceeded normal parameters. If it was staged, it required mechanical augmentation. He asked for originals. I declined. When I filed a formal report with the National Park Service requesting a joint investigation, the response was procedural and slow. 2 rangers were dispatched the following week. They retrieved the camera. When it came back, the SD card slot was empty, replaced with a new blank card. No chain of custody form, no explanation. That was when I understood institutional resistance wasn't passive. It was active. I had already copied the footage to my laptop and an external drive. I posted a short compilation online under a pseudonym, stripped of location data. Within 48 hours, it had spread beyond my control. Then my laptop was taken from my locked car in Sedro-Woolley. No forced entry, nothing else stolen. The Park Service contacted me the next day. I was told, explicitly, to discontinue independent analysis. The footage was deemed inconclusive. Resource allocation was denied. My contract renewal was placed under review. 2 weeks later, Trevor Hollis went missing near Cascade Pass. Experienced hiker. Proper gear. His backpack was found off-trail, damaged beyond what terrain alone would explain. Blood was present. The tracks nearby were documented by search teams before being classified as non-probative. 16 inches long. Barefoot. Human-shaped. The search was suspended after 10 days. Trevor's wife reached out to me after someone sent her my footage. She asked if I believed something non-human had taken her husband. I told her what I could confirm, that the area was now closed indefinitely, without public explanation, that multiple agencies were involved, that evidence had been removed or reclassified. The unresolved threat arrived last month. An anonymous email, no metadata. Subject line, "They're not alone." The attached file was recent trail cam footage from somewhere in the North Cascades. The same figures. Dozens this time. Standing in a clearing, facing inward. There was a tent in the center of the frame. I have not returned to fieldwork since. The official position is that no credible threat exists. Cascade Pass remains closed, and every camera I serviced that season has since been decommissioned. The data hasn't been disproven, it's just been buried. And whatever was watching those cameras understood exactly when to stop pretending it was unseen. The radio station that plays the future. Before November 2019, my life followed a predictable technical rhythm. I worked for a regional telecommunications contractor that serviced rural Oregon and southern Washington. Most days involved climbing towers, testing signal strength, replacing corroded lines, or upgrading emergency broadcast equipment for counties that rarely made the news unless something went wrong. I lived in Roseburg, rented a small duplex, and spent evenings reviewing schematics or logging maintenance reports. I didn't work with content. I worked with infrastructure. Signals either behaved according to physics or they didn't. That distinction mattered to me. The dispatch that changed everything came in mid-November. A defunct FM radio tower in the Umpqua National Forest had started drawing power again. According to utility monitoring logs, the station, KBRL 94.7, had gone off the air the previous year after its nonprofit license lapsed. No staff, no funding, no broadcast authority. My supervisor framed it as routine. Probably a breaker fault or a forgotten auxiliary feed. I was told to assess, shut it down, and document the condition. The site sat 25 miles east of Roseburg, accessible only by a Forest Service road that had eroded into deep ruts. Cell coverage dropped about 10 miles in. The forest there is dense, with limited visibility off-road. The tower itself rose from a clearing that felt abandoned long before I arrived. The transmitter building showed visible neglect. Collapsed roof section, broken windows, door barely attached. It didn't look operational. That's why the hum of active equipment inside caught my attention immediately. Inside, the transmitters were old but intact. Analog boards, cassette decks, equipment that should have been disconnected years earlier, but the power meters were active. The carrier signal was live. I checked the frequency, 94.7 FM, the same as the defunct license. I tuned my portable radio expecting static. Instead, I heard a live broadcast. The voice was male, neutral, professional. It delivered information the way emergency bulletins do, measured, precise, stripped of emotion. It described a fire in the Umpqua Valley, casualty numbers, road closures, evacuation zones. I checked my phone repeatedly while listening. No alerts, no news, no indication of any incident. I'd driven through Roseburg less than 2 hours earlier. Nothing matched what I was hearing. I recorded the broadcast on my phone. I checked for input sources. There were none. No microphones, no satellite feed, no phone lines. The system was effectively sealed. When I shut off the transmitter and cut power entirely, the signal continued. The meters went dark. The broadcast didn't. That should not be possible. I left the site and returned to Roseburg, stopping at a diner along the way. I asked casually about fires, accidents, evacuations. No one knew what I was talking about. I documented everything when I got home and emailed my supervisor. He responded hours later, telling me not to speculate and to wait for further instruction. 2 days later, on November 18th, a wildfire broke out south of Roseburg. Downed power line, 19 fatalities. Route 138 closed. State of emergency declared. Every detail matched the broadcast I'd recorded. I went back to the site the following morning without authorization. The transmitter was powered again. The equipment showed signs of recent use. I tuned the radio. This time, the broadcast was about me. It described a missing telecommunications technician. My name, my age, my employer. Last seen at the Umpqua site. The tone was the same, neutral, factual, complete. I shut everything down again and left immediately. When I reported this to my supervisor in person, his demeanor changed. He didn't ask for the recordings. He didn't want copies. He told me the site would be handled at a higher level and reassigned me to urban maintenance work. He also instructed me not to discuss the incident with anyone outside the company. The phrasing made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. A week later, another technician, assigned without my involvement, was sent to permanently dismantle the tower. He never returned. His van was found parked near the site, keys inside. No signs of struggle. The transmitter building was destroyed by fire. Official cause: electrical fault. The case was closed quickly. I requested the investigation records through public channels months later. Most of the files were redacted. The station license history had been amended to show deactivation years earlier. Utility logs for that week were missing. My own service report from the initial visit was no longer in the system. That's when I recognized the pattern. The broadcast wasn't predicting disasters randomly. It was cataloging events tied to infrastructure: power lines, roads, communication systems. And when a person became part of that system, when they interacted directly with the source, they were incorporated into the narrative. The evidence cache I still have consists of time-stamped audio recordings, frequency scans, and my original field notes. I provided copies to a federal communications oversight office after the second technician disappeared. I received confirmation of receipt and nothing else. 6 months later, I was informed the matter fell outside their jurisdiction. The silent dread didn't come from the broadcasts themselves. It came from the waiting. From nights when I'd scan the dial and hear nothing, only to catch fragments days later describing events that hadn't occurred yet. Accidents, structural failures, names I recognized from local news months afterward. The unresolved threat became personal last month when I heard my own obituary. Specific, detailed, cause of death listed, location named. Highway 38. I don't drive that route anymore. I don't interact with broadcast equipment unless I have to, and I document everything, knowing that documentation can disappear. The station site remains fenced and condemned, officially inactive, but 94.7 FM still carries a signal some nights. Not constantly, only when something is about to happen. The question I can't answer, and the one no authority will address, is whether the broadcasts describe the future or whether they participate in setting it. Because if it's the latter, then listening might be enough to make you part of the system. The Campground Where Time Stutters. Before the summer of 2020, my life was defined by routine movement. I was a freelance travel writer based in Bellingham, Washington, supporting myself through short assignments, seasonal features, and regional outdoor publications. My days were structured around deadlines, email pitches, and careful logistics. I traveled alone, kept detailed notes, and rarely deviated from itinerary plans. I did not chase risk. I documented places that were quiet, overlooked, and safe enough to recommend. The assignment that led me to Granite Creek came through a small regional magazine looking for a feature on undervisited Pacific Northwest campgrounds. The brief emphasized accessibility, solitude, and low environmental impact. Granite Creek appeared in a Forest Service database as a walk-in campground within Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. According to public records, it had been established in the 1970s and saw minimal use. No warnings, no special restrictions, just an asterisk noting limited maintenance. I emailed the Forest Service District Office to confirm access. I received a short reply confirming the trail was passable. No mention of closure. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late July and parked at the nearest Forest Road pullout. From there, the hike in was just under 3 miles. Dense forest. No signage after the first half mile. The trail narrowed but remained visible. The absence of sound was noticeable. No birds, no distant road noise, just wind through trees and the creek, steady and uniform. Granite Creek Campground consisted of 5 tent pads, a single fire ring, and no posted notices. No reservation placards, no bear boxes. Nothing to suggest recent use. I was alone. That first evening followed standard procedure. I set up my tent, took photographs, recorded location notes, and made observations about the site's condition. The creek was clear. The ground was dry. The place felt isolated but not threatening. At 7:30 p.m., I checked my watch and made a note about light levels under the canopy. At 7:34 p.m., my watch stopped. At first, I assumed the battery had failed, but the hands didn't reset or fade. They froze. I checked my phone. The screen was active, but the time displayed matched the watch exactly. 7:34 p.m. I tried restarting it. The screen went dark and stayed that way. No vibration, no power response. I noted the malfunction and went about my evening routine. I ate dinner. I sat by the fire ring. I waited for the light to change. It didn't. The forest remained locked in the same dusk state. No deepening shadows, no stars, no full darkness. The creek maintained the same visual shimmer. Eventually, I lay down in my tent and slept. When I woke up, the light was unchanged. My watch still read 7:34 p.m. I waited. I packed my gear. I began hiking back toward the trailhead. After what felt like 20 minutes, I reached the campground again. Same tent pads, same fire ring. My tent was still standing. I tried a different direction. The terrain repeated. The creek looped back. The ridge above the site led to the same clearing from another angle. There were no landmarks that indicated forward movement. The forest geometry felt intact but recursive. At some point, I realized sound had diminished. The creek was still visible but silent. Wind moved the trees without noise. My own footsteps made no audible impact. It felt as though the environment was functioning without feedback. I don't know how long that state lasted. My watch never changed. I slept and woke repeatedly. I ate rationed food. I counted breaths. Nothing advanced. The first concrete evidence that something was wrong came from a carving on a tree near the fire ring. It was shallow, recent, and deliberate. It read, Jessica Lowe, Tuesday, July 21st, 20 Osney. You've been here for 9 days. My name, my arrival date. Information I had not shared with anyone. I had not carved it. There were no other names nearby. I documented it with my camera, which still functioned mechanically but showed no time data. That was when panic set in. I screamed. I struck trees. I tested pain response. Everything registered normally. Then, without transition, my watch advanced to 7:35 p.m. The sky shifted. Sunset progressed. Sound returned in layers. The creek resumed noise. Insects appeared. I did not wait to observe further changes. I ran until I reached the trailhead. My car was where I'd left it, but it was covered in a uniform layer of dust and pollen inconsistent with 2 days of absence. I drove directly to the nearest ranger station. The ranger on duty checked his computer, then looked at me carefully before asking for my name again. He told me Granite Creek Campground had been closed in 2019 due to visitor disorientation incidents. He said search operations had been initiated for me 11 days earlier and officially suspended the day before I arrived. My phone powered on during the drive. The date was August 1st, 2020. Over the next week, I underwent interviews with Forest Service personnel, medical evaluations, and a psychological assessment. The official conclusion cited dehydration, stress, and dissociative episode. No environmental anomaly was acknowledged. I requested incident reports related to Granite Creek through a public records request. What I received was heavily redacted. Names removed, dates obscured. Multiple references to temporal disorientation categorized as navigational error. No mention of time loss. I began finding others online, forum posts, archived comments, messages that disappeared after a few days, patterns repeated, watches stopping, phones freezing, families reporting missing persons while the individuals believed only hours had passed. One man reported being gone for 6 hours. His family's missing person report documented 21 days. Granite Creek remains closed. The closure reason remains hazardous conditions. Last year, I received an unmarked envelope. Inside was an SD card. No return address, no note. The card contained a single video file. The footage showed me sitting at the fire ring at Granite Creek, staring at my watch. The timestamp read 7:34 p.m., July 21, 2020. The file duration was just over 23 hours. I do not remember being recorded. I have not received any explanation for who filmed it, why the footage ends before time advances, or how it was delivered to me. Granite Creek is still there, closed, unmonitored, and according to internal Forest Service documents I later obtained, incidents continue to be logged under a different site designation. Time still stutters there, just not on paper. The clinic where patients forget. I ran my private practice in Bellingham for almost a decade before Clearwater Springs entered my life. My days were structured and predictable. I saw patients 4 days a week, mostly referrals from veteran services, first responders, and survivors of domestic trauma. I specialized in PTSD because it rewarded patience and documentation. Progress was slow, but measurable. Memory mattered, continuity mattered. When the Pacific Wellness Initiative contacted me in early 2020, the proposal seemed unremarkable. They described themselves as a nonprofit expanding mental health access to underserved rural areas in Whatcom County. They wanted a consulting psychiatrist with trauma experience, 2 days a week, generous compensation, minimal administrative burden. The timing aligned with my own burnout. Seattle referrals were increasing. Telehealth hadn't stabilized yet. I agreed to visit the site before committing. Clearwater Springs was located 15 miles north of the nearest town, past farmland and secondary roads that lost cell service in patches. The clinic occupied a renovated farmhouse surrounded by forest on 3 sides and open field on the 4th. No neighboring structures. No signage visible from the road. The isolation was framed as therapeutic. Fewer distractions. Fewer triggers. During my first visit, I met Dr. Lawrence Finch, the program director. He presented himself as a researcher turned administrator, calm and precise, fond of saying the clinic operated ahead of regulation but not outside ethics. I noted the phrasing, but nothing about the facility raised immediate alarms. I began seeing patients there in April 2020. The first few weeks were routine. Anxiety disorders, complicated grief, depression exacerbated by isolation. My notes reflected normal therapeutic progression. Patients remembered prior sessions. They referenced earlier conversations. The first irregularity appeared in mid-May. A patient I'd seen twice before arrived for a 3rd session and introduced herself as if we were meeting for the first time. She showed no embarrassment, no confusion, just polite unfamiliarity. I reviewed dissociation criteria. It didn't fit. The following week it happened again, then again. By early June, I had documented 7 patients who failed to recall previous sessions despite detailed signed records indicating multiple visits. None had prior dissociative diagnoses. None were on medications known to cause amnesia. I raised the issue with clinic staff. The responses were uniformly dismissive: stress, pandemic anxiety, rural populations unfamiliar with therapy. Pattern recognition came from repetition. The same blank expressions. The same denial even when shown written notes. Several patients used identical phrasing. That doesn't feel like my memory. I began recording sessions with explicit consent, noting it in writing. I wanted objective reference material. On June 10th, I reviewed footage of a session with Thomas Griffin, a farm equipment mechanic referred for childhood trauma. The recording showed a coherent conversation. Insight, emotional engagement, future planning. The following week, Thomas sat across from me and asked who I was. I showed him the video. He watched himself speak. His affect remained flat. He said the person on the screen wasn't him. He denied recognition of the room, the chair, the topic, or me. That was my first hard evidence. I started auditing the clinic's internal processes. Clearwater Springs provided patients with daily vitamin supplements as part of an integrated wellness model. The pills were logged, distributed, and mandatory for participation. I reviewed the ingredient list. One compound was listed only by an alphanumeric code. I took a sample and sent it to a colleague at the University of Washington with expertise in neuropharmacology. 2 days later, he called me directly. He told me the compound was a modified benzodiazepine analog, not FDA approved, designed for rapid onset memory suppression with minimal sedation. He said it was structurally altered to evade standard screening. I confronted Dr. Finch with the findings. He didn't deny it. He told me Clearwater Springs was part of a long-term study on memory suppression as a therapeutic intervention. That trauma could be neutralized by selectively disrupting recall. He claimed regulatory oversight existed, but was non-traditional. He refused to provide documentation, citing confidentiality agreements and national interest. I informed him I was resigning and reporting the clinic. Institutional resistance followed immediately. My access badge was deactivated. My electronic notes disappeared from the system. Staff who had previously spoken freely avoided me. When I contacted the state health department, my complaint was acknowledged but delayed due to jurisdictional review. During my final visit to collect personal belongings, I experienced the clinic's only overt threat. As I walked to my car, I became aware of being watched. No voices, no movement, just the sensation of presence from the tree line. The building behind me was silent, no HVAC noise, no activity. The isolation felt intentional. I left without incident, but I did not return. 2 weeks later, Clearwater Springs closed. The official reason was funding withdrawal. No violations were announced, no investigation findings were published. I attempted to contact former patients for follow-up interviews. None remembered the clinic. None recognized my name. Several asked how I'd obtained their contact information. When I accessed my own backups, large portions of my Clearwater Springs records were missing. Session videos corrupted, metadata altered. My resignation email had been removed from my sent folder. The Pacific Wellness Initiative did not exist in any public registry. No nonprofit filings, no prior projects. Dr. Lawrence Finch had no verifiable academic history beyond conference mentions without affiliations. In late 2022, I received a medical journal by mail, no return address. Inside was a peer-reviewed article titled Memory Suppression as a Therapeutic Tool, a Longitudinal Study. The authors were listed as Lawrence Finch and Martin Reeves. I had not written it. I had not consented. But the methodology described matched Clearwater Springs exactly. Patient outcomes were anonymized. The conclusion framed memory loss as clinically adaptive. The article remains indexed. Clearwater Springs is no longer operating under that name. The property is owned by a holding company registered in another state. No signage, no tenants listed. Every former patient I've spoken to insists they've never been there. I remember all of them. That difference remains the most unsettling part. The road that eats travelers. Before the disappearances, my work along SR 20 was routine enforcement, speed enforcement near trailheads, disabled vehicles during winter closures, occasional DUI calls during summer tourist season. The North Cascades Highway is remote, but it's not lawless. Most incidents are predictable, and most drivers are simply passing through. I knew the corridor well enough to picture every turnout and mile marker without looking at a map. The first missing person report came in February 2018. A middle-aged man driving eastbound toward Diablo. Vehicle never located. No crash debris, no cell ping. At the time, it was treated as an isolated anomaly. People disappear in Washington wilderness every year. It happens. By May, there were 4 more. Different ages, different vehicle types. All vanished within the same 15-mile stretch between New Halem and Diablo. No surveillance footage showing them exiting the corridor. No fuel purchases logged beyond New Halem. The pattern was statistically unlikely. The trigger for my direct involvement came in August when a 7th report crossed my desk. At that point, Command requested a focused review. I was assigned as lead investigator for the corridor due to my familiarity with the area. The directive was narrow: review case files, identify commonalities, and determine whether additional resources were warranted. The geography matters. That stretch of SR 20 runs parallel to dense forest and steep terrain. Few pullouts, no services. Cell coverage drops almost immediately after New Halem. Radio repeaters are inconsistent. If someone leaves the road there, they are effectively isolated within minutes. Early irregularities appeared in the documentation. Dash cam footage from patrol units showed vehicles entering the corridor but never exiting. Traffic counters recorded lower outbound numbers than inbound during certain windows. Maintenance crews reported finding debris on the shoulder, cups, maps, loose change, but no abandoned vehicles. When I interviewed families, the similarities became more pronounced. Every missing driver reported a sudden sense of disorientation before losing contact. One text message recovered from a phone backup read, "Road looks wrong. Trees too close." Another voicemail cut off mid-sentence after a pause, as if the caller was trying to understand what they were seeing. I began pattern recognition work. Dates clustered around clear mornings. Most disappearances occurred between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. No adverse weather, no construction, no road closures. All vehicles were later model, mechanically sound. None had GPS anomalies recorded before signal loss. The first hard evidence came from traffic camera logs. Cameras positioned west of New Halem showed each vehicle entering the corridor. Cameras east of Diablo never recorded them exiting. There was no indication of camera malfunction. Power logs were clean. Timestamps aligned. When I escalated this to my immediate supervisor, the response was cautious but dismissive. I was advised not to overinterpret incomplete data. The cases were reclassified as wilderness-related disappearances rather than roadway incidents. That classification shifted jurisdictional responsibility and reduced oversight. In September, I decided to conduct a solo drive-through with full documentation. The goal was to experience the corridor under similar conditions and record anything anomalous. I logged my departure from Marble Mount at 6 a.m., clear weather, full tank, functional radio. 8 miles east of New Halem, the environment changed subtly. The road geometry remained consistent, but depth perception felt compressed. The forest canopy appeared denser. GPS signal dropped entirely. After 20 minutes of continuous driving, I realized the scenery had not changed. Familiar curves repeated. Mile markers did not progress. My odometer indicated I had traveled more than double the distance between New Harlem and Diablo. That should not have been possible. I pulled over to reassess. When I exited the vehicle and looked back, the roadway behind me was no longer visible. The shoulder transitioned directly into forest. No tire tracks, no pavement edge. That was the silent dread moment, standing in uniform in daylight with the certainty that established infrastructure had ceased to exist. Continuing forward was the only option. I located the first abandoned vehicle approximately 10 minutes later. A blue sedan parked cleanly on the shoulder. Plates matched Michelle Torres, reported missing 3 months earlier. Keys in ignition. Personal belongings intact, no damage. Over the next hour, I located 6 more vehicles. All matched active missing persons cases. All positioned as if the drivers had pulled over voluntarily. At 8:14 a.m., the road ended abruptly. Pavement terminated at a tree line with no indication of construction or collapse. I could hear voices beyond the trees, multiple, overlapping, calling for help. I entered the forest cautiously and located a woman seated against a tree. Alive, but severely disoriented. She identified herself as Michelle Torres. She could not account for the passage of time and believed she had been walking for hours, not months. The moment I escorted her back to my patrol car, radio communication returned. Dispatch responded immediately. Backup units were dispatched. When I looked up, the roadway behind us was intact. Normal, continuous. That recovery triggered a multi-agency response. Over the following week, all 6 other missing individuals were located within the forest near that corridor. All alive, all malnourished. All unable to recall leaving their vehicles. The official investigation involved the State Patrol, the Department of Transportation, and federal transportation safety representatives. Ground-penetrating radar, aerial surveys. No structural anomalies were identified. The cases were suspended without conclusion. Internally, I was advised not to pursue further independent investigation. My report was filed, then reassigned a different incident code. Records access became restricted. The stretch of SR-20 was closed for 2 weeks under the guise of maintenance. No structural changes were made. When it reopened, traffic resumed as normal. The unresolved threat resurfaced last month when 3 new disappearances were reported in the same corridor. Same time window, same lack of evidence. The road remains open. Officially safe. But the data shows it doesn't always behave like a road. I no longer drive that stretch unless ordered to. And when I do, I log everything, knowing that some distances on SR-20 don't measure the way they should, and that not every traveler who enters is guaranteed to exit when the road decides otherwise. The lake that speaks before. 2019, my work rarely drew attention. I was a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey assigned to long-term monitoring projects, quiet, methodical work, built on repeat measurements and controlled variables. Most of my days followed the same pattern. Early starts, equipment checks, field notes, then weeks of data processing back in the office. The goal was consistency. Nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. That year, I was assigned to a baseline water quality survey covering a series of remote alpine lakes in the Cascade Range. The program existed to establish long-term environmental trends, temperature shifts, oxygen levels, trace contaminants. These lakes were intentionally chosen for their isolation. Minimal human impact, clean data. Lake Serenity was one of the final sites on my list. The assignment came through as a routine addition. No special notes, no restrictions. According to the file, the lake sat at 6 to 400 feet, accessible only by a 5-mile trail through designated wilderness. Low visitor traffic. No prior anomalies. I scheduled the hike for mid-August, when snowmelt would be minimal and access reliable. I arrived at the trailhead on a Wednesday morning. No other vehicles were present. The hike in was uneventful. Granite slopes, dense firs, and long stretches where the forest absorbed all sound. When the lake came into view, it looked exactly like the photographs. Clear water, steep rock faces, no visible inflow or outflow streams. I set up camp on the north shore and began sampling that afternoon. Temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, all within expected ranges. Visibility was exceptional. I could see down through the water farther than at most sites I'd visited. As part of the expanded protocol, I deployed a hydrophone to capture underwater acoustic baselines. The device was standard issue. We used it to monitor geological noise, ice movement, and biological activity. Within seconds of submerging it, the readings changed. There was a low-frequency hum, steady, rhythmic, not random. I adjusted sensitivity, ran a second pass, then a third. The sound persisted. When I played it back through my headset, it carried a cadence that didn't match geological or mechanical sources. It resembled speech. I checked the equipment for interference, swapped batteries, ran diagnostics. Everything checked out. I recorded continuously for an hour and flagged the file. That evening, reviewing the audio at camp, I could isolate segments where the pattern sharpened. The frequencies overlapped with the human vocal range. When filtered, fragments resolved into words, incomplete, distorted, but recognizable. Helpless. Trapped. Under. I contacted my supervisor via satellite phone and described the anomaly. He told me it was likely acoustic reflection or a rare geological resonance. He advised me to note it and proceed. I didn't stop there. I ran a basic spectral analysis on my laptop that night. The results showed structured repetition inconsistent with natural sources. The intervals suggested deliberate pacing. The next morning, I prepared for a visual survey. I had a waterproof camera rated for depth and, given the clarity, expected only to document rock formations. I entered the water just after OE. At roughly 60 feet, the bottom came into view, and so did the structure. It was metallic, rectilinear, bolted directly into the bedrock. The framework resembled industrial scaffolding, coated in algae and mineral deposits that suggested long-term submersion. As I descended closer, I saw that it enclosed a space. Inside were shapes, human in proportion, suspended and motionless. I did not approach further. I surfaced immediately and returned to shore. My hands were shaking enough that I had trouble removing my gear. I made another call to my supervisor and demanded extraction, stating that I had found a submerged, man-made installation. He told me a team would be dispatched the following morning. That night, the lake was no longer silent. The hydrophone, still deployed, picked up the same rhythmic pattern, but louder, closer. When I reviewed the recording, and the distortion was reduced, the voices addressed me directly. They said my name. They told me not to leave, not to tell. I packed my equipment and left before dawn. I hiked out in darkness, off schedule, without notifying my supervisor. When I reached the trailhead, 2 unmarked vehicles were parked where mine had been. The men identified themselves as Forest Service officials. They were polite, efficient. They took my equipment, my recordings, and my field notes. They told me Lake Serenity was closed due to hazardous conditions, and that my findings fell under an interagency review. When I filed my report with the USGS, it was immediately classified. I was reassigned to a different region within weeks. No explanation was provided. Access to my original data was revoked. What I wasn't asked about was my backup. I had duplicated one audio file onto a personal drive out of habit, not suspicion. In 2021, I had it analyzed independently by an audio forensics specialist. He identified over 40 distinct voices layered within the recording. One of them stated my full name, my job title, and the date I arrived at the lake. That information had not been spoken aloud at any point during the recording. Lake Serenity remains closed. No public explanation has been issued. The site is listed as environmentally unstable. The program I was assigned to continues. And according to updated internal maps, the lake is still being monitored by an office that no longer returns my calls. The mill where shadows work. In 2017, my professional life was defined by repetition and predictability. I worked as a safety compliance officer for the Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Division. My responsibilities were narrow, procedural, and well-defined. I conducted inspections at industrial workplaces across the state, logging operations, sawmills, metal fabrication shops, small manufacturing plants. I was not an investigator in the criminal sense. I did not carry a weapon. I did not pursue wrongdoing beyond regulatory scope. My days followed a consistent structure. I reviewed inspection assignments issued through the internal scheduling system. I printed checklists tied to specific Oregon administrative rules. I drove state vehicles to job sites, logged mileage, conducted walkthroughs, interviewed supervisors, reviewed injury logs, and verified employee records. At the end of each day, I compiled findings into reports that were reviewed by supervisors and archived. I believed in documentation. I trusted that workplaces, even unsafe ones, existed within a framework of accountability. Employers resisted fines, but they complied. Workers complained quietly. Management negotiated deadlines, everything fit inside the system. I lived alone in Eugene. My personal life was quiet. No dependents, no medical issues, no disciplinary history. My performance reviews were consistently positive. I had been with Oregon OSHA for 7 years and had never filed an incident report outside standard violations. Nothing in my background suggested that I was prone to panic, hallucination, or fabrication. The assignment that sent me to Oak Ridge appeared in my queue during the first week of November 2017. Timberline processing, sawmill operation, follow-up inspection. The file indicated multiple prior citations over the preceding 12 months. Missing machine guards. Incomplete hazard communication records. Discrepancies in employee injury logs. None of the violations were severe enough to trigger immediate shutdown, but the pattern warranted a compliance verification visit. The company profile showed Timberline Processing as an active operation sourcing timber from nearby federal land. The site was listed as remote but operational, running a single shift. The contact listed was a site manager named Greg Holloway. The assignment was routine. I did not flag it as unusual. I printed the inspection packet, loaded my camera, forms, and personal protective equipment into a state-issued vehicle, and scheduled the visit for November 14th. No warnings were attached to the file, no notes from supervisors, no restrictions. I left Eugene before sunrise and drove east toward the Cascades. As I moved farther from the interstate, cell service degraded and then disappeared entirely. Oak Ridge itself was small, quiet, and largely empty at that hour. The road leading to the mill was unmarked beyond a single weathered sign indicating a Forest Service spur. The final 10 miles were unpaved. Dense forest pressed in on both sides. no houses, no other vehicles, no signage indicating industrial activity. The isolation was complete enough that it registered consciously, but not alarmingly. I had been to many sites like this. The mill came into view suddenly, a clearing cut into the trees. Large metal structures, stacks of lumber, conveyor systems, smoke rising faintly from a vent. It looked active. I parked in the designated lot and checked in at a small office near the entrance. That was where I met Greg Holloway. Greg Holloway greeted me by name before I introduced myself. He had my inspection notice printed and clipped to a clipboard. That level of preparedness was uncommon, but not unheard of. His demeanor was calm, cooperative, almost rehearsed. We began the walkthrough immediately. The mill floor was active, saws running, conveyors moving timber, workers stationed at various points along the line. The noise level was consistent with normal operation, and all machines appeared functional. It was during this initial walkthrough that I noticed the first irregularity. Workers were present in my peripheral vision, moving between stations, handling boards, monitoring equipment. But when I attempted to focus directly on any individual worker's face, my attention slid away. It wasn't blur or obstruction, it was absence of detail. My eyes registered movement and form but refused to resolve features. I assumed lighting or fatigue. Industrial spaces can distort perception. I made a mental note and continued. When I asked Greg how many employees were on shift, he answered immediately. 12. I paused. I counted again. There were more than 12 figures moving on the floor. I estimated closer to 20. When I pointed this out, Greg explained that some were contractors and temporary labor. That explanation was plausible, but incomplete. OSHA regulations require records for all personnel present during operations. I requested employee and contractor documentation. For the first time, Greg hesitated. Greg provided a printed roster listing 12 employees. 12 names. 12 Social Security numbers. No contractors listed. I reviewed the list while observing the floor again. None of the workers I could partially identify through body shape, height, or clothing corresponded with names I recognized from prior inspections at other mills. That alone wasn't proof of misconduct, but it added to the inconsistency. As we continued, I noticed additional patterns. The workers' movements were repetitive to an extreme degree. Each individual performed a limited set of motions without variation. No casual gestures, no verbal exchanges, no visible communication. They did not react to equipment noise, changes in timber flow, or my presence. No one made eye contact. When I stopped walking, the entire environment seemed to pause in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Not mechanically, but perceptually. The background noise remained constant, yet something about the space felt flattened, as if depth had diminished. I documented machine guard measurements and emergency stop placements, but my attention kept returning to the workers. I approached one worker operating a saw station and asked his name. There was no response. I repeated the question. Louder. He continued working, eyes fixed forward. I placed a hand on his shoulder to gain his attention. This was not standard practice, but it was not prohibited in the context of a safety inspection. He turned to face me. There were no facial features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, no expression. Just smooth, continuous skin where a face should have been. I stepped back immediately. I looked around the floor. Every worker was the same. Featureless, identical in that single, impossible way, moving, working, operating equipment with precision. The machines continued running. The world did not react to what I was seeing. That moment was silent in a way I have never been able to describe adequately. The background noise existed, but it felt irrelevant, like a recording playing in another room. I returned to the office area and confronted Greg Holloway. I demanded an explanation. I informed him that the inspection was suspended pending clarification and that I would be contacting my supervisor. Greg did not argue. He did not deny what I had seen. He did not attempt to explain it away. He told me I needed to leave the site immediately. I refused. I attempted to call my supervisor. The call did not connect. I tried again. No response. I attempted to dial 911. The call connected, but the operator informed me there was no service coverage for that location and instructed me to call back later. Greg positioned himself between me and the exit. He spoke calmly. "They're shadows," he said. "They work here. They've always worked here." There was no inflection, no threat, just statement. At that point, I became acutely aware of my physical vulnerability. I was alone, unarmed, in a remote location with no communication. The workers on the floor did not stop. They did not look toward the office, but I had the distinct sensation of being observed, not by individuals, but by the space itself. I left. I did not retrieve additional equipment. I did not complete the checklist. I exited the office, crossed the yard, and drove away without stopping. No one followed me. Back in Eugene, I filed a full incident report. I included photographs taken on my state-issued camera. The images were time-stamped and geotagged. They showed an operational mill in November 2017. They also showed workers with no faces. The report was escalated internally. Then it stalled. A follow-up inspection team was dispatched the following week. They found the site abandoned. No power, no active equipment. Heavy rust. Dust layers consistent with years of inactivity. Property and corporate records showed timberline processing had ceased operations in 2004, 13 years earlier. The company was listed as dissolved. Greg Holloway did not appear in any current employment, residency, or licensing databases. My report was reclassified. Portions were sealed. Internally, I was informed, informally, that pursuing the matter further would be career-limiting. I was not disciplined, but my assignments changed. Field inspections were reduced. Within 6 months, I was moved into office-based review work. No explanation was provided. There was no raid, no task force, no public acknowledgement. The intervention was administrative. The site was erased on paper. In 2019, I submitted a public records request related to timberline processing. The response stated no records existed beyond 2004. My inspection report was not acknowledged. The photographs I had uploaded were missing from the agency archive. I retained copies only because I had backed them up privately as part of my standard protocol. I resigned from Oregon OSHA in 2020. The site remains unfenced, no signage, no remediation. And according to internal logs I later accessed, inspection anomalies continue to be flagged in the Oak Ridge region under different facility names. Always remote, always resolved administratively, always gone by the time anyone arrives. I still have the photographs. They are time-stamped. They show a mill that should not have existed, and workers who never stopped working. The cabin that knows your name. Before my uncle died, my life was defined by predictability. I worked as a systems analyst for a mid-size logistics firm in Seattle. My days were structured around tickets, workflow audits, and long blocks of silent problem-solving. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, walked to work, ordered groceries online, and rarely deviated from routine. My world was screens, schedules, and controlled variables. Family was not part of my daily life. My parents had both passed years earlier. Extended relatives were distant in every sense, geographically and emotionally. Eugene Morrison, my uncle, was a name I remembered from childhood conversations, usually spoken with discomfort. He had gone into the woods, as my mother phrased it. Lived alone, didn't visit, didn't call. Over time, he became less a person than a cautionary footnote. I never expected to hear from him again. The call came in September 2020. A probate attorney from Port Angeles informed me that Eugene Morrison had died. Natural causes. Estimated time of death was vague, somewhere between 2 and 5 days before discovery. I was listed as the sole surviving relative. The attorney explained that Eugene owned a cabin within the Olympic National Forest. No outstanding liens, no will beyond the default inheritance clause. The cabin, its contents, and any associated land use rights would transfer to me unless I declined. At first, I assumed I would disclaim it. I had no interest in remote property. But the attorney mentioned the cabin had never been assessed or sold. No one had visited it in years except Eugene. He suggested I at least inspect it before making a decision. That suggestion felt reasonable. I told myself it was administrative closure. Nothing more. I drove to Port Angeles in early October and rented a 4-wheel drive vehicle. The logging road that led to the cabin was not marked. The attorney provided hand-drawn directions copied from an old Forest Service access map. The road narrowed quickly, pavement giving way to gravel, then dirt, then something closer to exposed earth. Cell service dropped out entirely. GPS stopped updating several miles before the destination. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense and wet, absorbing sound. Even the engine noise felt muted. The final stretch required careful navigation around fallen branches and deep ruts. When I reached the clearing, the cabin appeared without warning. No fencing. No signage. Just a structure sitting among trees that had clearly grown around it rather than away from it. There was no sense of abandonment. Everything felt paused. The cabin door was unlocked. That was the first thing that registered. Not alarming on its own, but inconsistent with isolation. Inside, nothing was disturbed. Dust lay evenly across surfaces. No animal intrusion, no rot beyond what age would explain. There was no electricity, no plumbing. Light came through small windows and reflected off kerosene lamps. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, though the stove was cold. I told myself that scent lingered. Shelves lined the walls. Books, journals, tools arranged deliberately. Nothing felt random. Nothing suggested neglect. I spent the first few hours cleaning, photographing items for documentation, and creating a rough inventory. That was when I found the journals. They were stacked chronologically, dates written neatly on the spines. The first was from 1998. The last ended in August 2020. Early entries were unremarkable. Weather observations, notes about wildlife, repairs to the roof, philosophical reflections that bordered on isolation-induced rumination but stayed grounded. Around 2003, the tone shifted. Eugene began documenting auditory experiences. Hearing his name called from outside the cabin. Always at night. Always from different directions. He emphasized restraint. Never responding, never investigating. The entries became methodical. Dates, times, duration, direction of sound. Later, visual sightings appeared. Figures in the trees. People resembling deceased family members. He described them in neutral terms, but always returned to the same detail. The eyes were wrong. Empty, reflective, unfocused. This wasn't a descent into incoherence. It was consistent observation. By 2011, Eugene wrote that the cabin itself had changed. Sounds inside when he was alone. Objects slightly repositioned. The sensation of being observed even during daylight. One entry stood out. Whatever is outside no longer waits. It listens from inside now. He never used metaphors. He never speculated about causes. He documented effects. The final entry, dated August 2020, was different in tone. It read like a warning addressed to a future reader. To whoever finds this, don't stay after dark, don't answer when it calls your name, and never, ever let it inside. I closed the journal and became aware of how quiet the cabin was. Not peaceful quiet. Absorbing quiet. The kind where sound feels like it would carry too far if it existed. It was 4 p.m. I decided to leave. As I walked toward my truck, I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered, spoken normally. Then it spoke details. My full name, my age, my city, the fact that I had inherited the cabin. Information I had not said aloud. I did not turn around, I did not respond. I entered the vehicle and drove until I reached pavement. That night, in a hotel in Port Angeles, I documented everything. Photos of the journals, notes, a timeline. Then I heard my name again. Outside my window, 3 floors up. The next morning, I contacted the attorney and told him I intended to sell the property immediately. He did not ask why. He simply acknowledged the request. When I contacted a local realtor, I was told the property would be challenging. Zoning complications, access issues, environmental restrictions. 3 prospective buyers visited the cabin over the next 2 months. All declined. One contacted me afterward and asked how the cabin knew his name. I requested records from the county. Eugene's death was listed as natural, no irregularities, no welfare checks on record, no complaints. When I reported the letter I received, handwritten, no return address, stating, "We're waiting," law enforcement took a report, but advised there was no actionable threat. I filed a public records request with the Forest Service regarding land use history. Most of the response was boilerplate, but one line referenced restricted access advisories issued in the early 2000s. The advisories themselves were not included, they were marked archived. No further explanation was provided. The escalation was subtle, not physical, not immediate. I began hearing my name spoken when I was alone, at home, in quiet spaces. Always familiar, always calm, never demanding. I never responded. I attempted to disclaim ownership entirely. The process stalled repeatedly. Clerical delays, missing documents, processing backlogs. On paper, I still own the cabin. The cabin remains unsold, unoccupied, undestroyed. The journals remain in my possession. I keep them sealed, documented, and scanned. No agency will acknowledge the archived advisories. No authority will explain why the cabin was allowed to remain occupied for decades without intervention. The voices have never threatened me. They have never demanded anything. They only acknowledge ownership. I don't know what happens if someone stays after dark. Eugene never documented that outcome, but I know the warning was precise for a reason. And I know that whatever is associated with that cabin understands inheritance, proximity, and patience. As long as my name is attached to that property, it considers me involved. Whether I choose to be or not,